Okay, guys, let's finish up our look at plants by looking at a couple things regarding how plants reproduce. Okay, so this is obviously not a botany class. We're obviously not going to go into great detail, but I do think an investigation of just the general principles behind plant reproduction is a good thing. So we want to know what the alteration of generations is in the plant life cycle. We want to be able to describe gymnosperm reproduction. We want to be able to describe angiosperm reproduction. And we want to be able to label and name the male and female parts of a flower. So those are the big takeaways we're after. Now, plant reproduction can have different pathways forward. So there's asexual reproductions that plants do, which is a natural form of cloning, right? And in this, some part of the plant, maybe a leaf or a stem or maybe even a section of root, is going to produce roots and become an independent plant that is a clone of the parent, parent generation. In sexual reproduction, the plant is going to produce male and female um, cells, sex cells, right, gametes, and they're going to combine to form a zygote, which is then going to grow into a new plant. It is important to know that the male sex cell in a plant is the pollen grain, and the female cells are in the ovule. Now, the question here says, what are some advantages and disadvantages of both? Well, the biggest advantage has to do with the fact that plants can't move, right? They are anchored to the ground. And while they may, sway in the wind and that kind of thing, for the most part, they don't walk. And so if you are unable to find another member of your species with which to engage in some sexual reproduction with, then being able to reproduce asexually is a great benefit for preserving the species. On the other hand, sexual reproduction, we've talked about quite a few times in biology. We know that breeds genetic diversity, which helps the plant species cope in the event of a change. So both of them have advantages. Now, the disadvantages of asexual reproduction would obviously be that there is a lack of genetic diversity, a lower rate of genetic diversity. It would only come about by mutation and not by the combining of two different parental genotypes. And the downside for sexual reproduction is it requires that you live near other plants of your species, right? So you have to be confined within that range. Oh, wrong way. So a couple things we just want to make sure that we go over one more time as we talk about this. Remember that haploid means you have one single set of chromosomes in each of your cell. Diploid, ploidy is the number of chromosomes. Diploid would be two sets of chromosomes. Remember that mitosis produces daughter cells, which are clones of the parent, and meiosis is the division process that produces four haploid gametes, right? And remember that a reproductive cell is a gamete, right? Just like that. Now, if we compare animal and plant reproduction, there would obviously be some things that stand out right away. So in the life cycle, we have something called the alternation of generations. And that's not something that we experience in the animal kingdom, so that may be new to you. Both gametes involve haploid cells. Plants can use spores. Spores are generally haploid, where animals don't obviously employ the use of spores. Gametes are made by haploid gametophytes in the plant generation, and they do this under mitosis. Spores are made by a diploid sporophyte under meiosis. So that's going to be new. Now, in animals, gametes are made by a diploid organism by meiosis. That's no surprise there. We've already learned about that. And obviously, we don't make spores, so there is no spore making process. So what is this alternation of generation I've talked about? Well, there's a double life cycle in most plants that has two distinct forms. There is the sporophyte generation, or the sporophyte form, where the organism is a diploid organism and it can produce haploid spores by meiosis. And then there is a gametophyte section of the life cycle where it is a haploid organism and it produces gametes, and it does this by mitosis. Now, in non-flowering plants, it is important to notice that mosses and ferns and those other plants that we talked about in the previous lecture, they actually have sperm that can move around. And so for them, their reproduction is going to require some kind of wet condition and having the male and female parts of the flower closer together. So let's look at mosses first. The mosses, we'll start right here with a zygote. So a zygote is going to grow and develop. It's going to become a sporophyte, all right? And that sporophyte, as it matures, is going to have what's called a sporangium. The sporangium is going to produce spores, all right? And it's going to produce those spores and drop them, right? It's just going to drop them out. So our spores are going to be produced. Now, there are male spores and there are female spores. So here are our female spores, and here are male spores. And so that male spore is actually going to grow. It's going to form a gametophyte, all right? That gametophyte's going to grow up, and it's going to have an antheridium. This is the part of the flower, or the part of the plant, sorry, that is the male part that produces sperm. And on the female spore, it's going to grow into a female gametophyte. It has an archegonium, and the archegonium is the female structure on the plant that accepts the sperm. So you can see the sperm is being released from the antheridium, and it is being taken up by this archegonium, where there is an egg, and that egg is going to become our zygote. So we have the peristome releasing the spores. We have the budding of our asexual growth there. And then we have step 6, where we have a mature plant that is going to result in the antheridium releasing sperm in order to fertilize the egg in the archegonium. And that fertilized egg is going to become the zygote. And so you have these two life cycles there. Now, in gymnosperms, or conifers, the reproduction is just a little bit different. The conifers have what we call reduced gametophytes. The pollen cones are the male cones. They produce male gametophytes, which are obviously going to be the pollen grains. And the seed cones have female gametophytes. Conifers rely on the wind to blow the pollen around in order to, lead to the fertilization of an egg cell. Now, again, we'll work at it right here. So we have our gymnosperm right there, and you can see that it's going to produce this ovulate cone, all right? And that's going to end up, when it is, as it grows, into what we call a megaspore, a mother cell. And when that is encountered with some pollen, all right, it will undergo meiosis, and the megaspore will result in a female gametophyte. There's still an egg, there's still an archegonium, and in that archegonium there is a pollen tube. Now, there is also a sperm nucleus inside this megaspore, and that can fertilize the egg. So here we have our fertilization. The fertilization leads to a zygote. The zygote becomes a mature seed. It falls on the ground, right? It grows into a seedling. You get a mature sporophyte, and we end up back over here with our pollen cones. Now, pollen cones, this little circular one, is what's producing our male line, right? So this is our male side. It's producing the pollen. Where we started, the ovulate cone is producing the female line, the egg line, right there. And they come together to make that megaspore. Okay, so that's gymnosperms. That's how a conifer reproduces. Now, in flowering plants, the last one here that we're really going to look at, we have the flowers. And the flowers have a couple different parts, 4 main parts you want to know. There is the sepal, which is going to enclose the flower bud and protect it. It's the thing you see that then like opens up and the flower comes out. There are the petals, which are, visually appealing. They attract pollinators. There's the pistil, which is the female reproductive organ of the plant, and the stamen, which is the male reproductive part. The stamen includes the anther, and the anther is actually the location where pollen grains are formed. And so we can see those right here. Now, notice that both the male and the female structures are present on the flower. So in the very middle, we have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. This is the pistil right there. All right, so there is the pistil. And then on the outside, we have the stamens with the anther at the top, and this is where the pollen grains sit. Okay, and the pollen needs to be transferred into the pistil, and then the pollen goes down. And here is the ovule, which is going to become a seed when it is fertilized by our by the pollen. So that's how that works. So when a bee comes along, right? So think about a bee. That's a common pollinator. The bee is going to pick up pollen from the anther, And then when it goes to another flower and it's crawling around looking for nectar or whatever it's after, that pollen can fall down into the style and end up in the ovary where it can fertilize the ovule. And, that's how the plant is going to reproduce. So that's not the only way pollen can move around. It can also move around from the wind. All right, it could be, you bump up against the flower and it shakes a little pollen off. All right, but ultimately the pollen has to get from the anther into the stigma there, into the pistil. Now, once you have fertilization inside a flower, then you're going to form a zygote. And this is a common thing, right? This is a word that we're familiar with. So when we see zygote, we should think fertilized egg. And that's going to become the embryo of our new plant. This is often called ripening. Now, the outside of the ovule is the ovary, and the ovary is going to mature. It's going to thicken. It's going to form the fruit, okay? And then when it falls on the ground, the plant embryo, the seed, can use the fruit or use the food that's been stored around it in order to develop, all right, and eventually grow some leaves so it can do photosynthesis. Now, germination is the process of the plant growing up from the seed out of the ground to form a recognizable plant. And so once it has favorable conditions, the seed will germinate, which means develop into an embryo, and it will become a new plant. It's a little bit different in monocots and dicots as far as the number of cotyledons that are present and, where the first leaf is going to come out and that kind of thing. But as long as you familiarize yourself with these two images, you'll be fine. Notice 1 versus 2, all right? That's a big giveaway there. So hopefully now you can talk about alternation of generations. You have a general idea of the pine cone function in gymnosperms and the flower function in angiosperms, and you can identify the male and female parts of the flower. So if you need to go back and look at that slide, just to make sure you can label it and identify them as male or female structures, and you will be good to go. That's all we're going to look at as far as plant reproduction. If you have any questions, give me an email and I'll be glad to give you a hand. But other than that, I'll see you guys in the next video.